Okay, good afternoon, colleagues. I know it's about 30 minutes to lunch, but we can say good afternoon, right? Good afternoon, colleagues. Thanks. Thank you to my two panelists before this, Ms. Kamalani and Dr. Makata Kuno, for setting the stage. So I've been asked to address a way forward for us to leverage AI in African higher education, and my my perspective today is for us to really think about some key elements as we start thinking about what do we mean by leveraging AI in an African education institution. And I've just got 6 points that I want to quickly run through, but I think it sets the stage for us, specifically coming from throughout the week, throughout for those that were in a conference before this as well, and also for us that are here through the pre-conference sessions as well, to really engage. What do we mean by AI in an African education institution? Now, the first point that I want to talk about is institutional assessment of AI readiness. Now, we've been speaking a lot about, the integration of AI in higher education, but one of the factors that is a challenge for us in the African context is how we ready as an higher education institution to fully embrace AI and in terms of its potential for us. And when we talk about the institutional assessment of AI readiness, what we're really talking about is to firstly understand the gaps in the system. And I've plotted a few points thinking about when we talk of assessing, what are we really talking about? The first thing is that we really need to think about the AI competencies of staff and students. We're throwing these concepts out with the assumption that everybody sitting in the room understands what AI is. We talk about students and we send out communication to students. You're not supposed to use AI software with assumption that students understand this. So the first one is really to assess our competencies of our students. The second is the readiness of institutional ICT infrastructure. One of the elements that can fail us in the African context is moving too fast in innovation and not having ICT infrastructure that can keep the pace of our innovations. The third point is institutional expertise. So when we move from institutional infrastructure, we're now talking about the human capabilities inside the institution. Do we have the human capabilities to drive innovation at the pace we are talking about in this particular conference? Right? We came out and we spoke about innovation that can transform the African space. But the question is, do we have the human capabilities in our institutions to drive the innovation that we are actually talking about in terms of this session? The next point is on policy and governance gaps. The reality is that none of our institutional policy speaks to AI. It's fairly new. So that means overnight our policies and our governance processes in our institutions have become outdated. But the challenge is we still have these policies on the table. We still have these legislations on the table and regulations. So the question here is we need to start identifying the gaps. And the last point here is contextual restraints. Is that throughout these sessions, I've been hearing about us talking about innovation. But the reality is that we are constrained in the African context in the global south. But nobody has spoken about really what does this mean for us when we start benchmarking ourselves against developing countries and try to keep up to the pace by ignoring the constraints that we have. The challenge with that is that we're setting ourselves up for failure because what we are really doing is following innovation as opposed to contextualizing innovation. And I think that's quite critical for us. So the very first point is we need to start thinking about institutional assessment of AI readiness. The second point that I want to talk about is the awareness and capacity development. Now, this for me is quite an important one because the first one is that we need to build a common understanding of AI. Now, why I'm saying this is that I've heard throughout this conference, ChatGPT and AI have been used interchangeably. It's not the same thing, right? But we've taken it for granted that a dominant tool like ChatGPT dominates the AI discourse. In reality, what we are doing is we're setting ourselves up for a problem and a failure in the long run if we don't start defining these concepts. The second point that under the same term of building common understanding of AI, we know that if we sat through the pre-conference sessions, you can have 50 people sitting in a room and they don't have a common understanding of AI. Imagine having a complete institution of 4,000 plus staff sitting and discussing how AI can transform an institution without a common understanding of this concept. So there is a need for us to start thinking of how do we drive common understandings of concepts in an higher education institution, or else we're going to find that there are fragmented views of what AI is, and we're going to start pushing individual objectives and definition as opposed to driving an institutional agenda in the African context. The next point is that we need to move away, we need to move into customized training. And Dr. Makata Kuno and Ms. Kamalani also spoke about training. But we need to start thinking about, do we have training that provides AI literacy? And there's a difference between digital literacy and AI literacy. We need to unpack these concepts. So we need to talk about AI literacy for the African context, but we can't stay where AI literacy is. We need to move from AI literacy to AI proficiency, capabilities and competencies that can be developed, right? We also need to move away from, and this is something quite important when we think of strategy and the way forward. One of the biggest challenges in higher education institutions is the silos between portfolios. And everyone is saying, yeah, is you have a teaching and learning portfolio that exists in isolation from ICT portfolio and an ICT portfolio that exists in isolation from a research portfolio. The fact that we're dealing with such a new dynamic and it's so complex, it calls for an alignment of the three portfolios, right? We cannot talk about a way forward in silos. We need to start moving to a much, much more integrated space where, for example, we engage with the three portfolios in a similar room. The next point is on open library resources, and we've heard this in some of the early morning presentations as well, is to think about how do we contribute to an open learning resource in terms of a library of resource specifically for AI. And for me, what's critical for this is that we've heard speakers talk about the African context, but the reality is we still marginalize in terms of knowledge production. So how do we start producing knowledge and start archiving those knowledges that contribute towards open resources, right? And then empower for active integration. And this is quite an important one for me, is that many of our discussions that we have still take place in silos. And I'm not talking about the portfolio silos. I'm also talking about silos in terms of the fact that you have students outside of this discourse of AI. How do we move students to the point of where they are engaged participants in how we're defining the integration of AI? What was quite interesting in the last conference that we had the week before this, we had a student come up and say, I love the fact that you all are engaging AI. By AI, actually, if I engage with ChatGPT as a student, I lose my student voice, right? And I thought that was so profound, because for a student to tell you, I lose my student voice when I start engaging with AI, and yet we as an institution have not profiled the implications and the impact that it has on a student, is quite critical for us. And we need to maybe take a step back and say, how do we bring students to the table to start thinking about the impact that AI has in their space? The next thing is the AI curriculum integration, enhancement, and delivery. And this is something that we need to talk about, because we tend to dominate the discourse on the fact that AI has the potential to rethink how we design teaching and learning. Yes, that's true. But the very first point is that what I want to flag here is that we need to start moving to a point of where we talk about the integration of AI-related concepts into our existing curriculum. Right? So while we are talking about the potential of AI, what about how AI is actually transforming our disciplines? And when I talk about discipline transformation, I'm talking about the implications of AI, for example, in agriculture, in computer science, in the humanities. We're not making that distinction that when we think of leveraging AI in African higher education, we're also talking about how AI is transforming our disciplines and what we teach in the higher education space. Right. The second is the AI designing teaching and materials. And we've mentioned, and I think this has been spoken a lot, is how do we use AI to design teaching materials? But also, how do we use AI specifically for assessments? And we need to move to a point of application and contextualization. But this is quite critical for me. The next point is AI skills. We need to rethink this. And I'm glad there's a lot of education people in the space, because we've placed so much of emphasis on creation. But when it comes to AI generation content, the emphasis is no longer on creation. The emphasis is now on validation of content. Are we validating what AI is generating for us as authentic knowledge? And this means that we need to rethink that entire system of what we put on the top of our pyramid as being the most critical skills. The next element is on AI plus work integrated learning. It is useless for us to produce graduates who have no exposure to AI and get into a working environment and are now looking for a job where the entire industry is regulated by AI, derived by AI, right? So how do we bring industry into the curriculum design space so that we start talking about what are the implications for AI in terms of work integrated learning? And then some creative developments that Dr. Makato Kuno also made reference to, the idea of virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, and gamification that now transforms our teaching learning space and even how we deliver teaching and learning content. The fourth point that I'll talk about is AI research and innovation. This is quite an important one for me, Madam VP CIO, and I'm hoping this very first point is what you pick up on, is that as an African institution, we need to establish a multi-inter and transdisciplinary AI research center. We really need that because we are following trends from the developed context that don't speak to our context. And one of the critical things is that we need in an higher education institution an MIT research center, an AI research center. And we need to drive this from a point of view that we can speak across the silos of the portfolios, but have an engaged center that can drive not just innovation, but application, can engage with legislation, with policy and government. And considering the fact that we have many critical institutions playing key or driving key developments in the country, this is something that we need. The AI models and tools to support local languages and dialects. And I think this is quite an important one for us, is that when we start talking about the languages and dialects, we need to start thinking about how do we leverage this in our African context. Also, the translation and adapting existing AI resources, we still need to think about what are the implications of decolonizing AI and the local adaptation. We know that we throw these concepts out of decolonization, but what does it mean when we start thinking of leveraging AI in African higher education, where we know for a fact that African knowledge is marginalized in the database, right? And then benchmarking industry trends is quite important for us, especially when it comes to work integrated learning. And the fifth point is data infrastructure and scalability and sustainability. And here I'm going to be a bit provocative because first point I want to say is that higher education institutions in Africa are gold mines for data, right? We know that we have, just take for example, UNISA as a mega mine for data, right? But we haven't fully utilized the importance of the data that we sit with and how we can use this to start driving the agenda in our country, in the continent. Data-driven developments and HI developments, specifically when it comes to industry, we've allowed industry to dictate to us, whereas we should also start working collaboratively with industry and say, what exactly is the education space needing in terms of African solutions for AI? And the next point is quite an important one for me, because when we talk of AI, the main thing that many of us think that overnight we need to scale this across the entire institution. Overnight we need to scale this across our education institution in the country. The challenge with that is that you cannot take something that we haven't tested and scale up immediately in this kind of context that we have, because we set ourselves up for failure. What we really need to do is think about how do we create spaces to incubate some of these innovations that we are putting up and then scale based on the positive models that we develop, right? And also cost-effective models. And my last points are on policy and regulation, is that in many cases, one of the biggest problems in African higher education institutions, and even in our own institution, and I can say this, is before we can even implement AI, we were already thinking about a policy. Yeah, I mean, we already know the contents of the policy, but you cannot develop a policy in isolation from its implementation. And for us, we need to, and this is why I threw the point right at the end, is that we put so much emphasis on the fact that we need a policy in the institutions, we need policy in higher education institutions, but we need guiding policies to implement AI in teaching and learning and student support. But the policies need to be evolving. If AI is evolving, why are we thinking of static, outdated policies that don't speak to these developments, right? Policies encourage innovation and collaboration. And then the last point I think is quite an important one for us in the African context is our policies and integration of AI needs to be linked firstly to the SDGs, which is critical for us. But we mustn't forget the fact that we have a Africa 2063 agenda, which also needs to speak to our developments in the continent. And the fact that BRICS is just down the road from where we are, it also means that we need to harness the potential in terms of our policy and implications of AI in terms of the BRICS agreements that we have as well. So if we really think of where do we go from here, it's really thinking in terms of these critical 6 steps for me is to think about step by step navigating the space, but realistically for us in an higher education context. Thanks, colleagues.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Chetty.